Welcome into the LSU Sports Insider Podcast. Today is Monday, March the 17th. It is St. Patrick's Day. Happy St. Patrick's Day. And it is also what used to be Selection Monday in the women's basketball world, but they've done away with that weird concept and now have Selection Sunday, just like the men's tournament does. And we are here to talk about LSU women's basketball draw in the NCAA tournament. I'm Zach Ewing, your host, with Reed Darcey, who is the women's basketball beat writer for The Advocate. And I don't know, Reed, it's like another year, another 3 seed for LSU. I guess that's just, why do they even play the games? Just give them a 3 seed.
It's something about 3 seeds. You know, it's 4 years in a row that they've been a 3 seed. And they were a 3 seed when they won the national championship in 2023, and they're a 3 seed again. It's every year that Kim Mulkey has been at LSU, they've gotten a 3 seed. So something about them, I guess they really like 3 seeds.
So we will talk about the draw in the next half hour or so, both in the short term, you know, San Diego State, what are they about? And whether Florida State or George Mason would be the more difficult second round opponent. We'll also talk longer term, Reed. Like, I actually think it's a pretty decent draw long term for them. We'll talk about that as far as getting to the Final Four.
I agree.
And then some injury updates and all of that sort of stuff, and just where LSU is. So we open with this. LSU will play San Diego State at 9:15 p.m. Saturday night at the PMAC. It is a very late game. You and I were just sort of we're having our journalist deadline complaint session.
Yeah, nobody wants to hear the sports writers complain, but you know we have to do a little complaining here. It's like, man, they didn't ask us about our deadlines before they set that.
Yeah, 9:15, and that's only if the Florida State George Mason game, which begins at 6:45, ends on time and allows them the half-hour break between games. Otherwise, it could start even later than that.
Yeah, it is the last game of the day on Saturday, the very last one. So you can get a nap in, make sure you're well rested, make sure you're ready to go, because that's going to be a late one. It's going to go late, and we'll be working late, obviously. We'll be working into the wee hours of the morning trying to get you that coverage of that game. So.
Yeah. So that is the little pod here in Baton Rouge. Is 3 seed LSU plays 14 seed San Diego State, and then 6 seed Florida State plays 11 seed George Mason. Those are Saturday evening. The winners play in the round of 32 game Monday night at the PMAC. Let's talk first about San Diego State, Reed. This is a team that would not have been in the NCAA tournament. They were a bid thief. They won the Mountain West tournament in triple overtime. Was it UNLV they beat? Is that right? I think it was UNLV. I looked at it this morning. We'll check on that. But point being, obviously not a great team, a team LSU should beat, but a team that is riding a lot of momentum.
For sure. And, you know, you look at LSU, I mean, they haven't had too much trouble with these early, these first round games. It's really when they get into the second round, the Sweet 16 is when they start getting some trouble. If you remember last year when LSU played Middle Tennessee in the second round, Middle Tennessee was an 11 seed that upset 6 seed Louisville to get into a matchup with LSU in the second round. So those are the types of things that you have to be on the lookout for. You have to be on the lookout for teams like that can push LSU in the first couple rounds. Now, I don't think San Diego State should give them much trouble, but like you mentioned, it is March and teams can get hot and they can ride that momentum, especially the ones that kind of sneak into the tournament because they win their conference tournament. So I think you have to be aware of those teams, look out for them, but you should expect LSU to win handily. Now, in the second round, it could be a different story depending on who plays LSU once they get past San Diego State. So it should be interesting to see how it shakes out. Not expecting too much from San Diego State, but we can talk about Florida State and George Mason. I think those two teams could be interesting.
Yeah, and I think bigger picture, like, is San Diego State going to beat LSU? Almost certainly not. I think I saw the betting line is LSU by 24.5. It's expected to be a blowout. LSU finally gets to step out of the rugged SEC schedule and play someone who physically does not match up with them.
It's going to feel like one of their non-conference games,
right.
I think.
And maybe that means San Diego State makes a run and makes it interesting at some point in the game, but for the most part, we expect LSU to pull away. I think the bigger picture, though, is that this was an LSU team that was banged up and looked tired the last week or two of the regular season, and then in the SEC tournament. Not terribly unsuccessful. They had the 2 losses at the end of the regular season that probably cost them any chance at a 2 seed. They lose to Texas in the SEC tournament. Their one game, they played Florida in the SEC tournament, who had pulled an upset the round before, so they didn't even get the tougher game in Greenville. So, like, LSU is not playing at its best, but they've had this break, and I think this game against the Aztecs is more of a it's a get right spot. I mean, obviously it's win or go home. You got to win the game, but it's also a spot to like have a little bit of a breather. We'll talk about some of their injuries later, but like get some of the players who are banged up back out there, let them stretch their legs back out, and maybe not have to play a full 35 minutes.
Absolutely. Get their feet wet, get them back in the rhythm, because Flage hasn't played in 3 weeks. You know, Anissa Morrow, she went down in the SEC tournament. We don't exactly know how close to 100% they are. We know they're going to both be playing, but the opportunity like that, because you're a 3 seed and you play a 14 seed, I think it's a really, really important for LSU to get a big lead early in that game and put San Diego State away early so that they can keep Flage and Anissa's minutes down, so that they don't have to fight and scratch through the entire game and have them playing 35 north of 40 minutes. I don't think that that's what you want. I think ideally you want to keep their minutes in check, keep them down, make sure they get their feet wet, and make sure they're knocking all the rust off before the really tougher games start to hit. So if you're LSU, I think you want to prioritize getting off to a fast start and making sure that you get a lead so that you don't have to rely too heavily on your banged up starters too long into that game, and you can really ease them back into action, because it's been quite a long layoff for Flage, and we're not exactly sure how close to 100% they are.
Okay, you mentioned the other game, the first game Saturday night, which will start at 6:45. Florida State and George Mason. Interesting game. I think everyone's going to look at it and say, oh, Florida State's favored, and they are. But George Mason is not a pushover by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, this could be, like, if you're a basketball fan, show up early and watch this thing, because it's going to be, I think it's going to be a pretty good one.
The nation's leading scorer is going to be coming to the PMAC this weekend. Her name is Tanaya Latson. She's really good, and she's really fun to watch. She'll be an All-American. Like I said, she's leading the nation in scoring, and it's going to be really difficult, assuming that Florida State can get past George Mason. That's going to be a really tough test for LSU, trying to figure out what to do with her, because if she gets hot, if she gets rolling, then LSU's going to have a tough time beating Florida State. She's a really good scorer. She can operate at all 3 levels, finish around the rim, finish in mid-range, and shoot threes as well. So I'd look to see how LSU kind of game plans around her, because I'm not sure Florida State has too much too many scorers around her, or too many players who can beat you besides her. But if you let her get going, if you let her get into any kind of rhythm, you could be in trouble. You know, because we saw last year, if you remember when LSU played Iowa in the Elite Eight, it really got Caitlin Clark going, and that's really all Iowa needed to win. I don't think Tanaya Latson is on that level as Caitlin Clark, obviously, but I do think that if she gets rolling, then LSU could be in trouble. So it'll be interesting to see. It's like these first 2 rounds, these matchups in Baton Rouge, you're really looking for players who can make a difference, right? These kind of difference makers, and she's definitely one of them. She'll be looking to I guess assert herself on a national stage and put the spotlight on her, because she's kind of flown under the radar as Florida State's kind of waffled in and out of the AP poll. So we'll see how she fares, and we'll see how LSU defends her. Assuming they meet, I think it'll be pretty interesting to see exactly how she fares against LSU's defense.
Yeah, I mean, Tanaya Latson is a really good player, and probably is as good of a scorer as some of LSU's top scorers like that. And she's the type of player, we see it every year in the tournament, where, oh my gosh, did you see that player went off for 35 points and they pulled an upset? Like, that could happen. I will say this, George Mason's only a 3.5 point underdog in the first game. They're 27-5. You look at, like, they won the A10 championship. You look at some of their results. They beat teams by double digits week in and week out, which is what you want to see from a team from a lesser conference like that. Like, are they sneaking by? Are they have a gaudy record because the conference is no good and they're just sort of just barely the best? They're trouncing teams. I mean, this is a legit team. Yeah, I wouldn't discount them.
Yeah, and it's similar to how I thought about Middle Tennessee last year. I looked at that game and I'm like, maybe Middle Tennessee can cause some problems here. And it turns out that they upset Louisville and they really pushed LSU. If you remember that game, Middle Tennessee had a double-digit lead on LSU, and LSU had to really fight to win that one. They committed a ton of turnovers, and the first half was pretty sloppy. Of course, they turned it on in the second half. So these teams can be frisky, especially the ones like you mentioned that win their games pretty decisively. In the A10 tournament, George Mason beat St. Louis by 30. Then they beat Davidson by 13, and then they beat St. Joseph's by 15. So they didn't really play a competitive, really a tight game in the conference tournament at all. I think that sort of speaks to their level of play, because you judge them against the competition that they played, right? And they're always kind of head and shoulders above the rest of their conference opponents. If you look, they played Maryland in the non-conference. They only lost by 10. They only lost, I believe, 2 or 4 conference games. They haven't really played a ton of power conference opponents. I think if I'm looking at the schedule here, Maryland was the only one. But yeah, that's really it. They're kind of an unknown.
A little bit of a mystery.
A little bit of mystery, and that in March, this time of year is when those mysteries can kind of spook you a little bit.
That's what makes this so fun, because we don't. I mean, you think, oh, Florida State to Nia Latson, yeah, this is going to be a great showdown Monday night. I wouldn't discount George. I'm toying around. If you can't tell, I'm toying around with the idea of an upset here. Like, they've got, they're kind of the antithesis of LSU. I think they have 10 players who average at least 10 minutes a game. They'll come at you in waves a little bit. I think 7 of them average at least 15 minutes a game. So it's like, whereas LSU has its rotation, they're going to stick to it and really only play 6 or 7 players in a given night. George Mason's going to come at you more in waves, and I don't know. That makes it interesting, especially if they do get out to a lead. Where can LSU find the energy with those players having to play big minutes? If that is the matchup, again, we don't know. Florida State, George Mason, and that's Florida State's problem first. But it will be interesting. And again, that one is the first game Saturday night at 6:45. 11 seed George Mason facing 6 seed Florida State. The winner of Patriots and Seminoles gets the winner of LSU and San Diego State on Monday night. Want to take a little bit of a bigger picture, longer term view of LSU and what this looks like in the big dance. Because, look, expectation, Reed, is that they get out of this first weekend. They've done it every year. Kim Mulkey's talked about wanting the 3 seed.
They've not done it every year. Kim Mulkey's first year in charge.
You're right.
They lost in the second round to Ohio State.
You're right. Yeah. So that, I guess that's the demarcation point between, was this a successful season or not? If you can't get out of that first weekend, I don't care what you did before, you're going to leave the season with a sour taste in your mouth. If you get to Sweet 16, Elite 8, lose to one of the top seeds, I'm not saying you're happy about it, but like you sort of get it, where you're, okay, LSU was a top 10 team and they ran into another top 10 team and the chips fell where they may. But you got to get out of this first weekend. So what we want to talk about is longer term and what LSU can do to set itself up for a long run in the NCAA tournament. First, we're going to take a 30-second break. When we come back, we will do that right after this on the LSU Sports Insider.
There's no better place to parlay than Caesars Sportsbook. With quick picks, you can tap right into pre-built, ready-to-bet parlays right from the home screen. And if you miss tip-off, no worries. You can play same-game parlays live during the action. Plus, it's never been easier to find and bet on the biggest matchups of the day, so you can keep up with all the action. Caesars Sportsbook, proud partner of the NBA and the only sportsbook app with Caesars Rewards. Download it today.
Okay, we're back here on the LSU Sports Insider Podcast. Zach Ewing with Reed Darcey. Just wanted to correct one thing. San Diego State beat Wyoming in triple overtime in that Mountain West final. They had beaten UNLV in the semifinals. So it was Wyoming and San Diego State that played the Classic. And that was, we're not talking about like this was yesterday or anything. The 3 overtime game is not going to have an effect. It was last week, just like the SEC tournament was. So they've had a full week off. But again, we're going to go under the assumption here for just a second that LSU beats San Diego State, that they survive the winner of Florida State and George Mason on Monday. And we're going to look ahead to Reed Darcey's long, arduous trip to Spokane, Washington.
Yes.
Which is the other sort of thing. And you kind of saw this coming. I mean, there's only 2 choices. The way the women's tournament works, for those who don't know, there's only 2 regional sites, and they each have 2 regional finals. So 2 were in Spokane, 2 were in Birmingham, which is obviously, for an LSU fan, for an LSU reporter, much would have preferred Birmingham. But Spokane it is.
Yeah, and I'll be interested to see how LSU fans travel to this one. LSU fans, they usually travel. I think the Albany regional last year was kind of a similar situation. That's a long flight, kind of tough to get to. And LSU fans had a pretty decent crowd up there, and obviously in the Sweet 16 and the Elite Eight, the crowds are great. I'll be interesting to see how exactly how it looks up in Spokane, because man, that's remote. It's tough to get to. There's no way to fly into anywhere else but Spokane. Seattle's 4 hours away, so you got to fly direct into there, and it's tough to get to. So we'll see exactly how the fans show up for this one. It's a long flight.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Spokane, just quick geography lesson, is like less than an hour from the Idaho state line. So it's way over in eastern Washington.
I'll be staying in Idaho.
There you go.
Assuming that they get there, I'll be staying in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho.
So yeah, and this time of year, you never know what you're going to get weather-wise up there, and we'll see. I mean, it's interesting. It's an interesting spot. I'd like to know the rationale for, it's probably money, but the rationale for why the NCAA tournament. It seems like they go to Spokane every few years for the women's.
It feels like a popular NCAA tournament site, and even like the men's side. I remember they play games in Spokane every now and then, because Gonzaga's right there.
Gonzaga is from Spokane, so yeah, it's a basketball town. I get that, but it's just difficult to get to. Yeah. I mean, that's the biggest complaint.
And I think going forward, I think now that the NCAA has invested a little more in the women's game, I think the sites are going to start to get a little better. I believe next year it's Fort Worth and Sacramento, if I'm getting that right. I could be mixing them up, but in the next couple of years, those two sites are going to start to be in a little more accessible cities, so that'll be good to see.
Yeah, but as for LSU, if they get out of this first weekend, it is Spokane, Washington for them. Now, I want to spend just a little bit of time, Reed, on whether the committee got this right for LSU. They gave them a 3 seed. That was what we expected. The only thing you could really complain about, I think, if you're a Tiger fan, is the Spokane thing. Man, it would have been nice to be in Birmingham. But, you look at the other teams in the region. NC State is the 2 seed. UCLA is the overall number 1 seed and the 1 seed in LSU's bracket. It's not like those places are close to Spokane either. Right. UCLA is West Coast, but it's still a long trip up there.
Yeah, and I think if you're LSU, I think you have to be pretty happy with how the bracket shook out. We knew that they would avoid South Carolina and Texas because those two teams are higher seeds than LSU. Turns out they're both 1 seeds, as we expected. The committee was always going to send those 2 teams to Birmingham, right? Which meant that the next team from the SEC would have to go to Spokane, because the committee wants to spread out those top teams from the same conference to make sure that they wouldn't meet before the Elite Eight or before the Final Four. So we were always expecting South Carolina and Texas to get sent to Birmingham, and LSU would be to Spokane. So when you look at it, it became, in terms of 1 seeds to be matched up with for LSU, it became either UCLA or USC. And I don't know about you, Zach, but I think if I'm LSU, or if I'm thinking about how they think, I think I'd much rather prefer to play UCLA, because you beat them last year in the Sweet 16, and USC has someone named Juju Watkins, right? Who's got to keep you up at night if you're any of these teams that got paired with them in their region. I'm looking at Spokane 4, or Spokane, the other Spokane region. USC is going to have to play UConn most likely to get to the Final Four. And so I think if you're LSU, you avoided UConn, you avoided USC, you avoided Notre Dame, which slipped down to a 3 seed. You avoided TCU, which is red hot. You avoided Duke, which is a 2 seed in South Carolina's region. And so that really leaves you with UCLA, NC State, Baylor, which would be interesting if they get to the Elite Eight and LSU meets up with them. It's a pretty favorable draw, because, if you remember around Thanksgiving, LSU played NC State, and they beat them by 17.
One of their more impressive,
very impressive win, right?
Season, yeah.
And NC State since then are a completely different team. I don't think you should look at them the same way. They got off to a slow start, and they've really found their groove lately. They've become hot, but I think if you're LSU, you have to be confident in that matchup. You say, hey, we went out, we won decisively, we won on a neutral court, and we won pretty commandingly. So why can't we repeat that in the Sweet 16? So I think it's, again, it's pretty favorable that. And, the 6 seed Florida State can be kind of dicey, especially since the nation's leading scorer is coming to Baton Rouge. But you get through that, there are worse opponents to play, especially since South Carolina and Texas and UConn and USC are all outside of your region. So I think LSU is pretty happy with how it shook out.
I don't think you can complain at all. And we've talked about this before, as far as, whether the committee, like Kim Mulkey basically said as much in the last week of the regular season. I don't care if I'm a 2 or a 3. I mean, she didn't come right out and say those words, but like all she wants is that top 4 seed, that protected seed. I think if you really drilled down and got the truth out of her, she'd prefer the 3 over the 4 because that means it's one more round before you have to face a 1 seed. It's one more chance for that 1 seed to get upset by somebody. Like you want to avoid that as long as possible. So to me, and we'll skip ahead here. Like this is set up for a run. Like I'm not gonna.
I think it is. I mean, if you were a 2 seed, right? The only thing I'm looking at, if LSU were a 2 seed, just pretend they were a 2 seed in the same region. Instead of playing Florida State in the second round, 6 seed, again, assuming there's chalk, assuming there's no upsets, you'd be playing Michigan State, which is a 7 seed. I think that's a pretty big difference. Michigan State's a solid team, but I look at Florida State, I think they're a lot more dangerous than Michigan State. So the only thing is I think the 2-3 line, it affects your second round matchup more than it affects your matchup in the Sweet 16, because either way, in the Sweet 16, assuming you get there, you're going to have to play a 2 seed. You're going to have to play a highly seeded team. So I think, it really matters about that second round matchup, but I think LSU's confident that it can get through that no matter who it was.
And of course, in the women's game, you get to play that at home.
Yeah.
So those higher seeds are going to have even more of an advantage in that situation. And so if LSU does get to Spokane, I was just looking at Bart Torvik's power rankings for women's basketball, which is maybe a little more predictive than just what the human polls are. And he's actually got LSU down at 14th in the country. Okay, now
that's as low as they are anywhere.
Some of that is they have not played Flau'jae Johnson. Mm-hmm. They have had some players banged up, and Issa Moro's banged up. They lost some games late in the year. Like they were more like 8th 3 weeks ago, so they've fallen. Mm-hmm. Okay, but if you look at the reasons for that and try to spin this forward and then look at who they're playing, well, Florida State's ranked 29th. If do the math, 4 1 seeds, 4 2 seeds, et cetera, they should be in the top 25 if they're a 6 seed, right? So 29th, that's actually a little bit lower than you'd expect. Again, they don't play the games on paper, so we're not predicting anything. But just as far as a draw goes, then if you make it to Spokane and indeed play the 2 seed NC State's ranked 16th. And again, you already beat them.
Yeah.
And then even though UCLA is the overall number 1 seed as seeded by the committee, they are ranked 4th in Bart Torvik behind UConn, South Carolina, and Texas. So you got, obviously once you get to the Elite Eight, you're playing somebody good. But as you said, you'd rather play UCLA probably than any other top team out there. You could argue UCLA and USC have played 3 times this year, I think, and they've all been battles.
And USC beat them twice. Yeah. UCLA beat them once in the Big Ten tournament. I just think a lot of people took issue with having UCLA as the overall number 1. I think people thought that South Carolina probably deserved that. I think if you asked Dawn Staley, she said that she thought they deserved that. So I think, if you look at it, UCLA is probably, probably a little bit higher than most people were expecting them to be. I think it's not really a surprise they were overall number 1, but I think there's a lot of people out there who would have had those top 4 seeds played out a little differently, because if you look at it, South Carolina and Texas, assuming there's chalk again, they're going to meet in the Final Four, and UCLA and USC are also going to meet in the Final Four if the bracket holds up. That means that South Carolina and Texas will be getting a 4th matchup between them, and UCLA will be playing a 4th time. So I think people wanted the committee to sort of shake up those teams a little bit and move them around so that you'd avoid those kinds of matchups in the Final Four.
The way it worked out is, again, they don't play the games on paper unless you've got to play well for this to even matter. But I don't think it could have worked out a whole lot better, because when you give UCLA the top overall seed, that means by bracketing principles, they get the lowest rated 2 seed. Okay, so because that means the lowest rated 1 seed gets the highest rated 2 seed. It's almost like a 4 versus 5 national. So this is like NC State is the lowest rated 2 seed. So here, who does that really benefit if the overall 1 seed is maybe weaker than a typical overall 1 seed, and the 2 seed is the worst of all the 2 seeds?
Who's the 3 seed?
That benefits the 3 seed. You could really make a case for LSU making a run here. And I just sort of thought of this on the fly, Reed, but that's going to be an interesting dynamic in that arena in Spokane, where UCLA will be playing. USC's also in Spokane, and you're going to have a bunch of USC fans they're not going to be cheering for their arch rivals in UCLA. Like LSU might get some support from the USC fans in the arena if that matchup ever takes place.
Yeah, we went through this last year. LSU was playing in Albany, but South Carolina was up there too. So it's kind of these weird dynamic when you have two regional sites. These teams are all grouped together, even though they're in completely different regions on other sides of the bracket. So it's a weird dynamic, and it's kind of interesting. I think it's not exactly a bad thing. It's just fun and unique that all these teams are grouped together in the same city, and they're all playing games. So you're around once you get to the Sweet 16, the Elite Eight. You're around all these different teams, and it can be kind of hard to keep track of who's in what region or who's playing what. But like you mentioned, a lot of teams, a lot of their fans converge on one site. And I think it becomes really interesting. A lot of fun dynamics there.
Yeah, no doubt. Quick injury update. You mentioned this. You referenced it at the beginning of the show. But Flau'jae Johnson and Anissa Morrow both dealing with some injuries. We talked a lot about Flau'jae's injury where she's, got the shin splints essentially, which is an injury that just requires a lot of rest. And that's what LSU gave her. You could argue, they should have done it before. If she was hurting in the Texas game, they could have rested her even longer. But she has had, by the time LSU plays Saturday night, she's going to have 3 weeks of rest under her belt, just about. I think the last time she played was a Sunday 3 weeks before that. So Kim Mulkey said yesterday that both are good to go.
Yep. Kim Mulkey said both are good to go. Both will be playing on Saturday against San Diego State. So we know that they'll be on the floor. We don't know exactly how close to 100% either of them are. Both injuries can be kind of tricky. Anissa Morrow in the SEC tournament, she aggravated a foot sprain, right? And so that's something that's kind of been bugging her. If you remember, she missed LSU's game against Georgia, the one they played after Texas, because it was that same injury to her foot. Kim Mulkey said it got stepped on some kind of way, and somehow it got sprained some kind of way. So that was re-aggravation of a previous injury. Flau'jae's kind of a different deal. It's kind of more of a pain management deal, kind of just rest it and let and give it time to heal before the games really start to matter. So she's had about 3 weeks to let that pain subside and let that inflammation subside. We know she's been working out a little bit. We know that she's still walking around in that walking boot when she's not working out. But yeah, I think it's kind of an unknown. We'll see once the game tips off on Saturday how they look. Do they look like themselves? Do they look like the best version of themselves? I think we'll only have to wait and see, and it's something we'll be watching throughout the tournament. Does it flare up on one of them in another round? Right? Do they land awkwardly in the Sweet 16? And does that re-aggravate whatever they're dealing with before? And do they have to miss time again, or are they limited again? I think it's probably the top storyline that we'll have to watch. We know they'll be on the court, but we don't know exactly how close to 100% they'll be and how it'll affect their game.
Yeah, and we'd love to see LSU get back to playing at its peak like it was in December and January, where these top players are healthy and ready to go. And these are injuries where I don't know that either one of them, you could push through I'm not going to speak for them, but they feel like injuries where you could push through the pain. If in a big game, you're like, oh, hey, I just need to kind of grit my teeth and bear it here. Obviously, that doesn't mean you're 100%, but I do think we're going to see them through the duration of the tournament, unless there's a re-aggravation.
Unless there's a significant setback. I think, both kind of deals, like you mentioned, are pain tolerance deals. But I think Flau'jae will get tested pretty early, assuming the bracket holds up and LSU plays Florida State in the second round. Maybe LSU puts Flau'jae onto Nia Latson, right? Flau'jae's your best perimeter defender. You're really going to need someone to shut her down and make life difficult for her, given Flau'jae's size and length. She's a natural candidate to do that, but how healthy is she, and how able will she be to do that? Because you need her offense as well. So do you want to tax her too much in her second game back, trying to defend the nation's leading scorer on one end and take up most of your offense on the other end? It'll be interesting to see. I think these decisions have to be made in the next few days, and we'll see how Flau'jae responds as she amps up her work, ramps up getting ready for the game on Saturday. So it'll be interesting to see how Kim Mulkey sort of plays her cards there and prioritizes the short term versus the long term in the tournament.
Yeah, no doubt. All right, so as we wrap things up here, looking at LSU women's basketball in the NCAA tournament, Reed, I'm not going to put you on the spot and say tell me exactly how far LSU is going to go. But I am going to ask you, what is success for LSU in this tournament? We talked about they at least have to get out of that first weekend. But given the draw, given the way their season has gone, and what this team is, how far does LSU need to make it to where they feel good about themselves? I mean, they're going to say the national championship's always the goal, right? But realistically, and the fans feel good about the season and everything to that ilk, is it just making it to Tampa for the Final Four? What do you think?
I think getting past the Sweet 16, anything short of that probably be a disappointing, probably something you can consider to be kind of a failure of a season, just because of the way it shook out. I think NC State, again, assuming that is LSU's opponent in the Sweet 16 or any of those other teams, I think you should expect LSU to get past that game, given how they fared against NC State earlier in the season. So I think anything short of that would be a disappointment. If you get to the Elite Eight and you lose a close game to, say, UCLA, I don't think there's any shame in that. I think UCLA is a really good team. They were the number one team in the country for most of the season. So, LSU is the type of team that, they're one of about 7 or 8 that can get to the Final Four, that can win the national championship. That doesn't mean that it's national title or bust or Final Four or bust. Like you mentioned, LSU had a really good team last year, and they fell short in the Elite Eight to Iowa, and that was sort of like, okay, Caitlin Clark in that game, she scored north of 40 points, had 12 assists, and there was really nothing you could do about it, right? So I think you might be facing a similar situation there, where you just get in this close game against a really good team and you lose, and you're one and done, and that's it. So I think LSU, you should expect LSU to get through the first 2 rounds, and then you should probably expect them to get through the Sweet 16, and then once they get to the Elite Eight, maybe a win and they can get to the Final Four, or lose, their season's over. But I don't think, getting to the Elite Eight, there's nothing to be ashamed of there. A lot of teams would love to do that, to be in that position. So that's the standard here, I think.
Yeah, I think it does matter who you play, though, too. Like, to me, if you were in the same region as UConn as your 2 seed, who might be the best team in the country, Reed. I mean, maybe we should make a quick pick, but like, if I had to make a quick pick, UConn would be my pick to win the national title.
Okay.
I'm going to go off the 1 seed line. If you lose, if UConn's your 2 seed and you lost to them in the Sweet 16, and then they go on to win the national championship, it's like, okay, well, you didn't win the national championship, but you ran into the team that did in the Sweet 16, right? Or like you said, maybe UCLA goes on to win the national championship if you lose to them in the Elite Eight. But if you lost to NC State, who you already beat by 17 points this season, and we all understand games are different from one matchup to the next.
I think that would be a disappointment.
That would feel disappointing.
Yeah, I think LSU views themselves as better than NC State, as a team that can handle them. NC State has had a really good end of the season, while LSU kind of stumbled down the stretch. But LSU's got more talent, and then they've got the recipe to beating NC State. So I think you should expect them to beat NC State, and I don't think that's asking too much.
Yeah, no doubt about it. All right, so we will follow LSU every step of the way on this tournament run. You can read all of Reed's stuff at theadvocate.com/LSU. In fact, for Friday night or Saturday night's game, you're probably going to have to do that, because I don't know that it's making it in the print edition with a 9:15 at the earliest.
We're going to try our best.
We'll try. But yeah, theadvocate.com/LSU is the place to go for that. We'll also be all over Facebook Live on our LSU Sports at the Advocate Facebook page. And of course, we want you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Hit the like button for us. Tell your friends, sign up for notifications, all of that stuff. And assuming that LSU does make it out of the first round, then Monday night we are planning a post-game show live from the PMAC. Reed, myself, Scott Rabelais will be there.
Yep.
Either LSU Florida State or LSU George Mason. We will have a post-game show for you Monday night on this same YouTube channel. So our producer today was Robert Young. This is not possible without him. He's Reed Darcey. I'm Zach Ewing. Thank you all for watching the LSU Sports Insider.